Okay, so continuing where we just left off in our discussion of the present continuous uh, versus the simple present, we are now at our fifth row, right? Which describes an opposition between what are referred to as performatives for the simple present and description for be plus verb ing. So performatives is as I said, it's a fairly rare use of the simple present, right? Now, what I'll describe first will be, I guess, what we could call pure performatives, ones that everyone kind of agrees on, and then afterwards we will sort of see how we can extend this concept to cover more statements, if you will, more ways of using the simple present. So the sort of classical performatives are actually something that were kind of discovered, if you will, or studied in the 1950s. There's an English linguist called Austin, and he wrote a book. It's called "Doing Things with Words," right? As the title suggests, um, um, this is an influential book. Really had a lot to. It had also really made it over to France, and people were interested. This is what is referred to as l'approche énonciativiste. This book was studied by really studied by a lot of French linguists, and in this book, Austin says that sometimes there are certain actions, right, in sort of modern society, well, not necessarily in society, let's say that can only be accomplished with words. For example, what actions? An action could be to get married, right? Okay, in typically if you want to get married, notice we are talking about very ritualistic things. It's all a question of, are you going to do this in a church, or are you going to do this, at the town hall? But at any rate, at a given time, it's either going to be the priest or some working for the government is going to say, I declare you. Well, in English, the sentence will be at least, I declare you man and wife. Right? And the person might say, I hereby. That this is a word. This is an adverb. Hereby, Hereby. I'll write it. I'm sure you might not find it very legible. Hereby, it's a compound. Hereby means dans et par ces paroles, right? So the idea is the act of getting married, right, can only be accomplished by. Notice here we are talking about a certain ritual, sort of having to do with institutions in the town hall. And a certain person, not just anyone, is able to pronounce these words. It either has to be a priest or a civil servant. So someone who has sort of a special function, right, in very often sort of a ritualized circumstances, the words of this person in this very specific context, right, will carry weight, will actually, given if the ritual is performed sort of as planned, and the person pronounces these words at the right time, right, then this action happens, right? So, and that is sort of the strict use of performative. Now, the thing to notice is that certain conditions need to be satisfied. Now, the speaker, to actually have a performative work, needs to use the simple present, and also they needs to use the first person. It's sort of like me in pronouncing these words. You can't say he is now. You need to say I declare you. There needs to be the use of the first person. In this case, singular. We could think of a use where we use the first person plural, but it has to be first person, and it has to be in the present simple. So that is a special kind of use for the present simple. Another example might be, let's say, a judge sentencing someone to a prison term or something like that. Now, as you see, these are really specific uses that really require, given institutions and certain rituals to be fulfilled, for them to be valid, to actually make the thing happen, such as making someone go to prison or having someone be married. And there are some linguists ask the question, right? So how far can this go? For example, if I say, "Oh, I promise to do something," how this is the idea is like, je m'engage, right? I sort of commit myself by saying this thing. The question that you might ask, I'm not going to give you the answer, right? But very many people will argue if you say, oh, I promise to do something, right? You might argue that that is what we call a speech act. I say performatives. I am, by saying something, doing something, right? So once again, coming back to this book by Austin, right? Doing things with words. The question we might ask ourselves is, to what extent is it a speech act when you say, I promise to do something, right? So that's a specific use of the present simple. And the comparison will be, of course, when we have this idea of description. If I say, for example, the person who is supposed to marry someone who is, let's say, a civil servant who says, I declare you man and wife, if the person say, I am declaring you man and wife, it doesn't work anymore. The person would only be sort of describing what's happening. That would not be a speech act. So once again, that's just to remind you that it is a necessary condition to perform a speech act is that the simple present be used. And once again, this is pretty rare, right? We're only talking about a small percentage of utterances. So that is why we are on our fourth, fifth, and sixth row once again, except for the use of B plus verb ing for the future, right? We're talking about less sort of major uses, if you will, of these verb forms. And lastly, we come to what is referred to as the narrative present, right? And this is sort of a way to sort of anticipate what we're going to see next week. Next week, we're going to look at the past versions of this, right? So here, notice we're comparing the simple present to the present continuous. Next week, we're going to look at the simple past and also the past continuous, right? And as it were, right, we can use, right, the simple present to tell a story. I can say, for example, notice that this is going to be familiar, just like we can in French. I can say, I wake up, I call my friend, we decide to have coffee, we have our coffee. So you can see I'm saying I wake up, simple present, I call my friend, and what I'm doing is that I'm telling someone a story of something that already happened. So this can work, right? But it's important to note that this will, and there's a slight difference with French, is in French this is not necessarily informal. In English, this is informal. Notice I'm talking about a sort of an informal kind of situation where I'm basically talking about what happened that morning, right? In this sort of informal, and I'm talking about sort of everyday events, and I'm presumably speaking to someone who I have a familiar that I am familiar with, that I have a sort of familiar relation, not a formal relationship. In this context, I can say, yeah, so I wake up, I talk to so and so, we get together, we have a coffee, and that's very natural in that sort of informal context, right? Okay, whereas you should not be this is just once again a reminder of something that's common. If you are writing, let's say, a history paper, you should not use this simple present in this way. It can sort of be used as a poetic device, but you will not use it if you are talking about, let's say, I don't know, let's say you're writing about the horrible CIA intervention in Iran, where in 1953, where Prime Minister Mossadegh was overthrown. You will not say in 1953, the CIA planned a coup. You're going to write, they planned a coup. Notice we use the French word un coup d'état, un coup militaire. We say C-O-U-P, we say a coup. So anyway, so we will say, if you're speaking sort of colloquially in a familiar setting, you can say, oh yeah, the CIA planned a coup. They planned a coup in 1953. But when you're writing in a more formal setting, be aware of the fact that it is frowned upon, I should say, by purists to say, to use this narrative present for when we're talking about relating past events. We're going to look at this more in detail as when we study the simple past, because what we're going to learn is this is sort of the basic. This is sort of the most basic way that we use the simple past to tell stories, things that are done and happened before, right? But what we're learning now is it is also possible, right, as a narrative, what we call the narrative present in an informal context. Okay, now what we will see later is how the progressive, the present progressive can also be used. Notice, and we're going to see this more in detail. So I'm going to give a sort of a brief example. We'll look at this more in detail next week. But just briefly stated, if I'm telling a story, very often a storyteller has a whole, what we call sort of a narrative mechanism, right? And this is something to be really aware of. This will really help you when you're in your literature classes, in which you give, on the one hand, you give sort of background events, right? These are things that are sort of, and think about it in terms of pictorially, when you have sort of, let's say, a painting, right? There's going to be the subject and there's going to be the background, right? Okay. So in the same way, right, that the painter will use certain techniques when painting the background and other techniques to sort of what we call to foreground, right? That's a verb that we use to depict what is in the foreground. Let's say describe the subject of the painting, right? Okay. Similarly, when we have like a story, we have sort of the main events, and we're going to tell the main events with here. If we're using the narrative present, that'll be to tell the main events of the story. I wake up. What's the story? Well, I'm the subject of the story, right? Okay. I wake up. I call my friend. We have coffee. These are the main things that happen. Now, the background, right, is sort of what happens before and afterwards, and that is sort of happening sort of contextually. And I will use be plus verb ing to do so. And that is why I say this is sort of a system. It's sort of a narrative system. For example, I will say another story. Je veux dire que je suis en train de me promener. Remarquez que et ensuite quelqu'un me bouscule et on a une dispute. In English, if I'm telling that in a familiar setting, to give the background, right? Not the story is not me walking. The story is someone bumps into me, right? Donc, ce qui est en arrière-plan, ça va être avec le B plus verbe ing. D'accord? Donc, so what I'm going to say is, yeah, I'm walking down the street. Le récit propre n'a pas commencé. On peut dire en quelque sorte que si c'est un roman, il s'agit de l'incipit du roman. D'accord? Donc, supposons que je narre les événements d'un roman. Ça serait, je ne sais pas, un nouveau roman, mais un roman écrit au présent de narration. Je vais dire, oui, je me promène, je me balade, il y a des oiseaux qui chantent, et ça c'est... Et notice in French, j'emploie juste le présent simple. En anglais, this will be I'm walking along. The birds are singing in the trees. On remarque, the birds are singing, B plus verbe ing, present continuous, parce que c'est pas une histoire de moi qui me promène, ni des oiseaux qui chantent dans les arbres. C'est ce qui se passe en arrière-plan, et d'un seul coup, l'action propre commence. When this guy bumps into me. Ah, donc j'ai passé du B plus verbe ing au présent simple au moment du début du récit propre. D'accord? Et si vous voulez, ça c'est l'écho assez précis de ce qui se passe en français avec l'alternance ou une certaine alternance entre l'imparfait et soit le passé composé, soit le passé historique ou le passé simple. Par exemple, dans un roman balsacien, il y aura, je ne sais pas, dans le pension, je ne sais plus le nom dans la Père Goriot, le pension, Vauquier peut-être, le pension Vauquier, je ne sais plus. Dans cette pension, je ne sais pas, le Père Goriot, il mangeait imparfait, et sa soupe, il discutait avec quelques convives lorsque Rastignac arriva vous comprenez, en passe de l'imparfait, qui c'est là, et en passe de l'imparfait, de l'emploi de l'imparfait, au réciproque, ouais, avec le passé simple. Vous voyez? Donc c'est pour ça qu'on peut parler d'un sorte de système narratif, d'accord? Où il y a l'imparfait pour qui désigne les actions, les événements plutôt, en arrière-plan, et il y aura le futur, les temps simples. En français, vous avez dans un récit traditionnel, vous aurez le passé simple, le passé historique si vous préférez, ou disons que si à partir de Camus, avec l'étranger, c'est le premier roman écrit à ce qui paraît, mais on m'avait souvent dit, et je le crois, Et il est très bon ce roman d'ailleurs de Camus, L'étranger. C'est apparemment le premier récit français au passé composé. On va employer le passé composé ou le passé simple pour narrer les événements, mais ce sont les événements propres euh, avec les temps simples, le passé composé en français. Whereas in English, right, we are going to have the background events, right? Just the ones that we would have in l'imparfait in French are going to be with be plus verb ing, right? You know, Père Goriot, disons que version modernisée, familière, you know, Père Goriot, he's having a soup, and he's talking to the other, you know, the other people that live in the pension Vauquier, when Rastignac enters, and now we arrive at our récit propre, right? The true story, right? And hopefully you can see that is what we mean by what we call sort of putting things foregrounding and backgrounding, right? Okay, so that is how, and it's I think it's a useful metaphor when you think of the fact, and think of it being a technique, a narrative technique, very similar to the pictorial ones. For example, you know, if you use perspective, if you're a painter, use perspective to make sure that the subject is in the foreground, and that would be sort of like using in our case, the simple present. And then you would also use perhaps, you know, make things kind of fuzzier, the colors kind of hazier. You would use sort of the horizon line and all these sort of techniques, right, to make it clear that that other things that you see are not sort of the subject of the painting, but they're sort of things going on in the background, right? And that would be, of course, what we would, and that's what we would, that's sort of the equivalent, narratively speaking, right, with be plus verb ing. So I hope that's clear. That's it, right, for our final three rows of our opposition between the simple present and be plus verb ing. What's great is now I hope you, what would be nice, you can watch this video obviously as much as you want. You don't have to watch it any more or less than you actually really want to, but it would be excellent if when we see each other next week, you ask some questions about what I said. You could say, wait a second,